So, which is the best Canon mirrorless camera on the market for weddings? Let's find out. And I'm going to start right now. So this is our tier list you can see here, from S tier all the way down to F tier. S tier being the very best and F tier being, yeah, I do not recommend buying this camera. And what we're going to do is having a look at all the cameras at the bottom, and we're going to be looking at overall specs as well as price point. But we're not just looking at the best specs like the highest resolution camera or the camera that can shoot the highest frames per second, because that doesn't necessarily line up with what's best for wedding photography. We're going to be looking at overall body design. Does it have dual SD card slots? Does it have a good battery life? What's the size and weight? And kind of rounding that off to work out what is the best camera specifically for wedding photography. And the first camera we're going to look at is the Canon EOS R7. So let's have a closer look at the Canon R7. So it's actually Canon's very first APS-C sized RF camera with a photo resolution of up to 32.5 megapixels with a frames per second of up to 30 frames a second in electronic shutter. It's also one of Canon's few cameras with image stabilization built in, or IBIS, up to 5 stops of image stabilization. But if you couple it with one of the newer RF lenses with image stabilization, they kind of work together, offering up to 8 stops of image stabilization, which is really impressive. You've also got a maximum ISO of 32,000, as well as this camera does offer dual SD card slots, which I think is really important for wedding photography. You've also got the larger battery type, the LP-E6NH battery, but that does weigh the camera down, coming in at around 612 grams. Now, as you can see, a lot of the specs that you need for wedding photography are higher in this camera. You've got dual SD card slots, which I put as a very important feature, making sure that you can shoot redundant. So if you ever do have any SD card corruption issues, you've got a backup, because again, you can't shoot a wedding again. That would ruin the day. So it has that, which I think is really important, as well as it's got good battery life, thanks to that larger LP-E6NH battery. The only thing that I really think the R7 is letting down for wedding photography is actually the sensor size. If you're starting out, I think APS-C or any camera really works, but me personally, I do recommend a full frame camera for wedding photography. I've been shooting full frame for a long period of time now. It does offer many benefits. Firstly, it doesn't offer a crop factor. Secondly, it's better for low light because obviously a larger sensor captures more light, as well as it gives you a greater depth of field, which is nice again for portrait photography. That doesn't mean I wouldn't recommend the R7 for wedding photography, but I do personally think there are better cameras out there. But it does have very important specs. So it does have that dual SD card slots, it does have that battery life, and to be honest with you, it's not a very heavy camera. So if you're thinking of maybe buying 2 and put them on a dual camera harness, which is what I do, you don't want cameras that are really heavy. So the R7 is fairly small and lightweight. So it's not terrible, but I definitely think there are better cameras out there. So I actually think, because it's got all the specs apart from that kind of APS-C sensor, I actually think I'm going to put that A tier. I really think it's a really good camera for wedding photography. But me personally, I still think probably... Oh, should I rank it S? No, I'm not going to rank it S tier. It would be S tier if it was full frame, but because it isn't, I'm going to go ahead and rank that A tier. Okay, so next we're going to have a look at the Canon EOS R50. Now, this is one of the newer cameras on the market. Again, it's got the same APS-C sized sensor as the R7, but slightly lower resolution of 24.2 megapixels, offering a maximum frames per second of 15 frames per second, which is actually pretty good even in electronic shutter. Now, this camera has no IBIS. It's actually got the same ISO performance as the R7 of 32,000, but it's only got a single SD card slot. The battery type is the slightly smaller, the LP-E17, but because of that, it's a far lighter camera, coming in at just 375 grams. Now, as you can see, it is an okay camera. If you actually look at the price point, it only comes in currently at £739 body only. So actually, it's a really cheap camera versus the other cameras we're looking at today. But it doesn't have a lot of the important specs that I recommend for wedding photography. The sensor is actually pretty good. 24 megapixels is a good amount of resolution, although it is an APS-C size sensor, which is not terrible, but it's not as good, obviously, as full frame for capturing in low light, as well as that depth of field we looked at previously. But things that let it down, I think, is the battery type. It's just you're going to have to buy a lot of batteries, as well as it's only got a single SD card slot, which isn't necessarily great for wedding photography. It's not a terrible camera, but it's definitely on the cheaper side of things, and if you're a professional, that may not necessarily line up with what you're after. Things like a single SD card slot, not great. Battery life, not great, but it is a small and lightweight camera, and obviously it's that RF mount, which is great because you've got a great selection of lenses, which are far more important for overall image quality than the camera itself. But the rest of the specs I think are pretty good, but overall I don't think, because of those, you know, SD card slots, you need two if you're a professional. So I think I'm going to rank that quite low. Just because of that, I think I'm going to rank that D tier. It's still a great camera and a great spec camera, but for wedding photography, I definitely think there are better out there. So the next camera we're going to look at is the Canon EOS RP. It's actually the second RF camera to be released after the Canon EOS R, and weirdly, it's still available brand new, even though the Canon EOS R isn't. It's also the cheapest full frame camera you can buy, coming in with a 26.2 megapixels. Now this camera's got a terrible frames per second of just 4 frames per second, as well as it doesn't offer image stabilization. It's got a maximum ISO performance of 40,000, which is pretty good, but again, it's only got a single SD card slot. It also takes a smaller battery type, the E17 battery, and coming in at 440 grams. But it is the cheapest full frame camera, coming in at £1,049 at the time of making this video. So to be honest with you, I actually really didn't like this camera. I've used it a couple times, and the thing that really bugged me is just that frames per second. It is just genuinely terrible. It's like click, 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 terrible. And although you don't need very fast frames per second for weddings, for me, I just don't think this lines up very well. And the overall image quality, I didn't really like either. Doesn't matter, I just didn't like the colors. I don't felt it was very Canon-esque. When you shoot on a Canon, you have these lovely colors, I find, especially straight out of camera, and I don't think the Canon RP just captured that, weirdly. I didn't mind the camera, but it wasn't a camera I liked shooting with, to be honest with you. Again, it really comes down to the lens options that you have, but me personally, I don't think I really like this camera at all, especially for wedding photography. That single SD card slot, not very good. Battery type, it drained battery really badly. The video quality wasn't very good, although we are just looking at the actual photography quality. And I didn't really like the sensor, to be honest with you. So I'm not going to rank this very high at all. Probably going to rank this... let me think. I'm probably going to rank this D tier along with the R50. I actually think these are very similar cameras in image quality stance. And yeah, I just didn't personally get on with the RP very well. So yeah, not a camera I personally recommend for weddings. Now the next camera on my list is the Canon EOS R6 Mark II, one of the newer cameras on my list, and I've got to admit, this is probably one of the best cameras you can buy currently. A full frame sensor offering 24.2 megapixels with up to 40 frames a second in electronic shutter. It's also got IBIS up to 5 stops, but 8 stops if you place it with an image stabilized lens, as well as a maximum ISO of 102,400. It's got dual SD card slots. It's got the larger battery type, although that does make it a slightly heavier camera, coming in at 670 grams. And at the moment, body only comes in at £2,799. Now this is a really good camera for wedding photography, probably one of the best cameras you can buy at the moment when you look at overall specs. Great for photography, great for video, everything you would need for a wedding, to be honest with you. If you're a wedding photographer or even if you're a wedding filmmaker, this camera is exceptional. The main thing really is an expensive camera, but I personally think it's a camera you should definitely save up and buy. This camera could easily last you 2, 3 or even 4 wedding seasons. It's just got everything you need. Now, comparing it to the original R6, it's got a slight boost in resolution, around 20%, from 20 megapixels to 24 megapixels. It's not a massive difference, so out of the two, they're probably similar. But what personally I see from it is it's got great video specs. If you're jumping from the R6 to the R6 Mark II, it's far better when it comes to its overall, firstly, video resolution, shooting up to 180 frames versus just 120 when you look at its 1080p, as well as sporting both 4K 50 and 4K 60 frames. So this is a camera I definitely recommend saving up for, and it's probably one of the best wedding photography cameras you can possibly buy at the moment. So this is an easy one. I want to go ahead and place this S tier because, yeah, you can't get much better than the R6 Mark II. Now the next camera is actually very similar to the R6 Mark II. In fact, it's got the same sensor, the Canon EOS R8. This camera here has got the same full frame sensor as the R6 Mark II, coming in at 24.2 megapixels, as well as it's got the same frames per second of 40 frames a second. What is different though is the IBIS. No IBIS in this camera, but it has got the same maximum ISO of 102,400. but it's only got a single SD card slot, as well as the battery type is the slightly smaller LP-E17, and it's also slightly lighter, coming in at 461 grams. And obviously all of that makes it slightly cheaper, coming in at £1,699. Now, you'd think this would rank really, really high, but the two things that I think lets it down is the actual body design itself. It's only got a single SD card slot, not great for weddings, not shooting redundant. I personally think that's really important. And it's got a smaller battery, which means it's going to drain battery really quickly. But ignoring that, this camera is incredibly well spec'd. IBIS, to be honest with you, it's not a major thing. It doesn't have IBIS. You don't really need it for weddings, as long as you're shooting at the correct shutter speed. You don't want to get blurry photos anyway. For video, it might play a little bit more of a prominent role, IBIS, but for photography, to be honest with you, I don't think it's really that important. But for weddings, you need two SD card slots, in my opinion, especially in 2024, and those batteries could be really annoying. Constantly changing batteries throughout the day, that could really wind you up. Plus, you're gonna need to buy more of them. Sure, they're cheaper, but you could end up with have to buy 10 batteries just to use 2 cameras. But apart from that, I actually think this camera is really well spec'd. It's almost got the same specs as the R6 Mark II, while almost at half the price. So if you're more budget orientated and you still want to have great photography resolution and video resolution, especially when it comes to the quality of it, this camera is incredibly well spec'd. So I'm not going to rank this super high because it needs those dual SD card slots, in my opinion, but I actually think it's pretty good. So I think I'm going to rank this, I think I'm going to rank it B tier, just because that sensor is exceptional, especially for the price point, only coming in at around £1,600. That is really good value for money, especially when you compare to the R6 Mark II. So next up is my camera. This is it, the Canon EOS R5. I own 2 of them. Recording one now, and obviously this is my secondary camera. Love this camera. It's a camera I personally chose for weddings. Obviously it doesn't mean, I'm trying not to be biased on this one. I won't rank it S tier because I do still think the R6 Mark II is a better camera overall. It's obviously a little bit newer as well. So this camera here is obviously a full frame sensor. It's the highest resolution camera on my list today, offering up to 45 megapixels with a maximum frames per second of around 20 frames per second in electronic shutter. Comes with image stabilization up to 5 stops, and again 8 stops if you place it with an image stabilized lens. It's got a maximum ISO of 51,200, and this camera's actually got not 2 SD card slots, but a CF Express Type B card as well as SD card, because obviously it has a higher resolution. It's got the slightly larger battery, the LP-E6NH battery, but it does make it slightly heavier, coming in at 738 grams, as well as it being one of the more expensive cameras on my list today, coming in at a whopping £4,000 at the time of making this video. So out of the 2, I still actually would recommend the R6 Mark II over the R5. Sure, it's got a slightly higher resolution, but to be honest with you, apart from that, the specs are pretty much the same. The thing I dislike about this camera is it doesn't have the same card slots. So it's got CF Express Type B versus SD card, and personally, I prefer SD card. They're cheaper, smaller, and they're just easier to transfer. Like my Mac Studio has got an SD card slot that I can input, so it's really easy to transfer photos, where with a CF Express Type B card, they're larger, more expensive, and you're going to need some kind of reader, which adds to the price. So personally, I prefer SD card slot, but I understand why the R5 has a CF Express Type B card, because it can shoot up to 8K 30 in RAW. It's got obviously a higher resolution sensor, which is great, especially for weddings, but not necessarily essential for weddings. So although I should rank this S tier, because obviously I personally think it's the best camera, hence why I brought 2 of them, but I'm not going to rank it R6 Mark II. I'm probably going to put it on the same level as the R5, because again, not having the same, if you do want to shoot redundant, you're going to have to shoot on 2 card formats, and that's just irritating. So I think I'm going to rank that A tier. Similar to the R5 is the R5C. Now, there is slight differences between these cameras. Basically, the specs are the same. So again, 45 megapixels, 20 frames a second in electronic shutter. This particular one doesn't offer IBIS though, because it's a cinema line camera. So if you are wondering what's the difference, IBIS is definitely something to consider. It's got a maximum ISO, again the same. It's got the same card slots, same batteries, slightly heavier because the body design is slightly different. And at the moment, it is slightly more expensive, by around 20 quid, coming in at £4,019. Now out of the 2, If you are maybe a filmmaker, the R5C obviously has many benefits. Unlimited record time, it's fan cooled, so the R5 is notorious for overheating. The R5C is fan cooled, so it won't necessarily have that problem, but the battery life won't be as good. But it does have far better cinema line specs, so the video specs are better. But because we're not necessarily we're just looking at photo quality today, naturally the R5 is going to be better. It's lighter, battery life's going to be a bit longer, and it comes with IBIS. So I'm not going to rank it. I'm going to rank it the same as the R5. These cameras are so similar. The only difference is obviously the video. And personally, I would love having those video specs, but at the moment, the thing is, I brought the R5 before the R5C come out, and I'm not going to sell them and then buy the R5C. I'm getting almost the same camera. That's why I bought the C70, which is the latest camera I've got at the moment. So yeah, I think I'm going to rank them the same, but to be honest with you, out of the two, I'd probably say the R5 is just ever so slightly better, mostly because of the size and weight, and also, if you don't need the video specs, don't buy the R5C. Okay, so next is the R3, current flagship lineup of the RF cameras. But does that make it the best wedding camera? Let's have a look. So the specs, again, it's a full frame sensor offering 24.2 megapixels, up to 30 frames a second in electronic shutter, offering IBIS as well, 5 stops or 8 stops if you place it with a lens, maximum ISO of 102,400. It's got the same card slots as the R5, so CF Express Type B plus SD card. It's got the slightly larger battery, so it's got this weird battery that places in the battery kit, which is what makes the camera so heavy, but it's also the heaviest camera on my list today and the most expensive, coming in at £5,499. Now, this is the only camera on my list today with a stacked sensor, which means it has a really fast readout. Is that good for weddings? Not particularly, to be honest with you. It's way over-spec'd for weddings. You don't need any of these specs, to be honest with you. I personally would recommend the R6 Mark II over the R3, hands down. You're just not going to need any of the specs with the R3. I think the biggest disadvantage you buying the R3 is the size and weight. It's a really, really heavy camera, about 400 grams heavier than the R6 Mark II, and carrying 2 of those around for a wedding is really going to hurt your back. So yeah, unless you're maybe a wildlife photographer and wedding photographer, maybe that makes sense. But to be honest with you, those specs are just way over the top for weddings. You're not going to need them, and you're going to be spending so much more extra money on specs you're not going to be necessarily using for weddings. So although the R3 is a great camera, it's not as good for weddings, I think, as the R6 Mark II, and I think it's just too expensive. So I'd much recommend buying maybe a couple of lenses or something like that and the R6 Mark II than buying the R3. Although it's technically a better camera and it's the flagship, for weddings, yeah, it's just way over spec. So I'm not going to rank that anywhere near as high. I think I'm going to rank that B tier. I think it's a B tier camera, definitely for weddings. You know, I wouldn't say it's a bad camera, but for weddings, I think there are definitely better options, especially in the current Canon lineup. So next we're looking at is the R10. So again, it's one of the APS-C cameras, one of the newer ones on the list, offering 24.2 megapixels with a maximum frames per second in electronic shutter of 15 frames a second. This camera's got no IBIS with a maximum ISO of 51,200. It's got a single SD card slot and it's got the slightly smaller battery, the LP-E17, although that does make it slightly lighter, coming in at 429 grams. And currently, body only, it comes in at £1,099. Do I recommend this camera? It's good, but for weddings, I think definitely there are better options out there, especially for the price point. It's actually quite an expensive camera. I personally would recommend buying the R7, that's about £400 more at the moment versus the R10. You're getting far better specs, and to be honest with you, better build quality. So out of the two, I'd say the R7 is a better camera than the R10, although it's technically more expensive, it's not that much more. And out of the two, the R7 just makes so much more sense for weddings. The R10 is more of a hobbyist camera or the first camera that you'd buy. It's, to be honest with you, way overpriced for what you actually get. So I think I'm going to rank that C tier. It's definitely better than the R50 and the RP, but nowhere near as good as the R8 or definitely the R7, which is so similarly priced. So yeah, R10 is good, but not great for weddings. And the last camera on my list is the Canon R100, currently the cheapest RF mirrorless camera you can buy from Canon. So this has got an APS-C size sensor offering 24.2 megapixels, which is actually a decent amount. The frames per second though is dreadful. Only coming in at around 3.5 frames a second, and that is in electronic shutter. No IBIS with a maximum ISO of 12,800, a single SD card slot, a slightly smaller battery design, and it's the lightest camera coming in at just 356 grams. And currently, audio only comes in at £489. Now, do I recommend this for weddings? No. I don't think it's a good wedding camera at all. It's actually really cheap. I believe, although I haven't actually used this camera, the actual LCD screen isn't touchscreen, which is just so bizarre. Yeah, sure, it's the cheapest camera on my list, but come on. Touchscreen in 2024? That's got to be, you know, I'm not too sure because I haven't used it, but I don't think it has touchscreen. But write down in the comments, I might be wrong on that one, but I do believe it doesn't have touchscreen, which I just think is so bizarre. But yeah, this camera, I do not recommend. Easy one. I'm going to go ahead and place this in F tier. It's a good starter camera, but for professional weddings, yeah, not recommended. So let's have a look at the overall tier list. So right at the top, in S tier, you've got the R6 Mark II. This camera is tip-top and probably one of the best cameras you can buy at the moment. Even when you look at Sony and Fujifilm and even Nikon, this camera is incredibly well spec'd and for what you get, really well priced as well. Sure, it's not the cheapest camera, but a camera I definitely would recommend saving up to. In A tier, you've got the R7, R5 and R5C. The R7 is really good and almost as good as the R6 Mark II. Again, really good specs. The only thing I would say is that APS-C size sensor could limit you with crop factor, so you're going to need to buy a really, really wide lens to get nice wide shots, which in some cases might be important for wedding photography. It won't have as good depth of field and as good ISO performance. So for those reasons, the R6 Mark II will sit above the R7. And it's the same with the R5 and R5C. R5 is obviously my camera of choice, really like it, but the R5C is so similar. Although the specs are different with video, I would actually place them on the same list or the same A tier. I think they're really good. The disadvantage to the R5C is it doesn't have image stabilization or IBIS, which could be important in some cases, but most of the time for weddings, I don't think it's that important. But if you're more of a hybrid shooter, shooting both photography and video, now the cameras are so closely priced, the R5C just makes so much better options. That unlimited recording could become really handy for video, and obviously it's got a fan, so it's never going to overheat, or it's less likely to overheat in really hot environments. But if you're just a photographer, because of the size and weight, I'd probably say the R5 is still a better option. Next, you've got B tier, which is the R8 and R3. The R8 is so close spec to the R6 Mark II, but that battery and the single SD card slot could be really disadvantaged for weddings. Again, you've got to shoot redundant. I can't emphasize enough how important shooting redundant is for weddings. The last thing you want to do is lose an entire card just because of corruption. So having redundancy in place, having spare hard drives, I think is incredibly important for things that you can't replicate, like weddings. But for everything else, like for example, YouTube videos that you can film again in case you do have a corrupt card, the R8 is tip-top, really good. R3, too overpriced. Easy one today. Just, it's too expensive. So yeah, for that, I just think B tier, easy one. C tier, you've got the R10. The R7 is just so close priced. Buy the R7, don't buy the R10. It's just so much better of a camera. So yeah, easy one for that. D tier, you've got the R50 and RP. The R50 is still quite a good camera, quite well priced, especially when you look at the R10, you are getting almost very similar specs, although the body design isn't very nice. And the RP, to be honest with you, it's just too old now. The actual frame second will just drive you insane. Plus a slightly smaller battery and single SD card slot. It's not a camera I personally recommend, but it is the cheapest full frame camera. So at least you've got that going for it. And then lastly, you've got in F tier, the R100, the cheapest on my list and the camera I least recommend, to be honest with you. It's just not a camera good for weddings. But for your very first camera, this could be a definite good purchase. And there we go. There is my YouTube style tier list for all of the current Canon mirrorless cameras on the market. I ranked the R6 Mark II the best, but of course, write down in the comments below if you agree or disagree. Are you like me and love the R5 and think that's the best camera? Make sure to write it down in the comments below. I've been James for Photo Fever, and I'll catch you guys next time.